Hello, welcome to Herp Corner, where we'll be discussing the axolotl, also known as Ambystoma mexicanum, or the Mexican walking fish. Note that they're not fish, but salamanders, and they don't walk on land. This is the most undeniably well-known of all the herps we've covered. You may or may not have seen these animals in pet stores, reptile expos, animation memes, or anything of the like. Axolotls are among the many animals that are known for being bizarre and weird. They're up there with naked mole rats, blobfish carcasses, and proboscis monkeys. Some might confuse them for a few other salamander species. That's because the axolotl is unique in that they're in their larval stage forever. Kind of. They're neotenic. Neoteny is when the adult of a species looks very similar to the juveniles. A lot of salamanders in their early stages of life look similar to axolotls. The typical axolotl you're familiar with is the Leucistic Variant. Leucism is a partial loss of pigment in the skin, scales, or feathers. This isn't to be confused with albinism, which is the full loss of pigment in the skin, scales, or feathers. Leucistic animals retain the colors in their eyes, hence why the axolotl you're familiar with has black eyes and not red ones. They grow to around the size of 6 to 8 inches and live for approximately 15 years. The typical wild-type coloration of this animal is dark olive with small beady eyes and a long tail, crowned with purple external gills. Most captive-bred axolotls can actually glow under a black light due to them carrying GFP, also known as green fluorescent protein. This happened through a few having jellyfish DNA injected into them, then was inherited into most future generations. Note that the protein is of no harm to them. Axolotls were discovered in 1798 by George Kearsley Shaw and Frederick Polydore Nodder, Shaw being an English zoologist and Nodder being an English illustrator. They're native to a tiny little part in Mexico City, specifically the city called Milpa Alta. Maybe not so fun fact, this is the species with the least geographic range we've covered. Why is that the case? Well, they're judged by the IUCN Red List as critically endangered due to them being fished. There have been conservation efforts to stop their population from decreasing, but to no avail. The entirety of the land they're native to is surveyed and protected, with educational efforts being there. But people still fish for axolotls in the deep water lakes they're found in. Other than that, threats to them consist of droughts, invasive non-native species, and garbage being dumped in their lakes. But this raises the question, why can't they just breed more species in captivity and use those to repopulate the waters? Just like the project in Thailand for the blunt-headed burrowing frog. Well, the differences lie in their adaptivity. The samples born in a lab or in an aquarium aren't used to natural predators or competition. They'd go into the waters, fight over food with the others, completely jeopardize the survival rate, and probably speed up the decrease in population numbers. So, not a great idea. That raises another question. Why is losing the wild in the axolotl so bad if they have them in captivity? Well, in the wild, they're found in the deepwater lake of Xochimilco, which is home to the Aztec-built water transport systems, those of which are home to around 900 species of fish. Not only is that a crucial part of Aztec history we cannot afford to lose, but that's a lot of biodiversity, most of which would be lost if we lost the axolotl, which might sound a little strange until you remember how important every part of the food chain is, and not to mention that if the axolotl becomes extinct, the land might not be protected anymore, which could leave it so that there's little reason not to completely destroy the land in favor of building more housing. But, of course, that's a slippery slope fallacy, which means that'll never happen, right? Right? Quick history lesson. In the early 13th century, when the Aztecs inhabited Mexico, they celebrated the axolotl. Axolotls were often depicted in Aztec artwork as symbols of creation, said to be their god, Quetzalcoatl's twin brother. They were often eaten as a delicacy or used medicinally. Nowadays, they're caught in the wild for similar reasons. Thing is, axolotls have always been revered for their ability to regenerate limbs. A lot of scientists are dedicated to studying how they're able to, and whether or not we can make the human body possess the same ability. Whether for cell damage or to cure cancer, a lot of scientists studying this ability are sourcing their axolotls from the pet trade, i.e. captive-bred specimens, which is good, and doesn't shrink the wild population. But there are still some that source from the lakes in the wild, which is not so good. But either way, the fact that captive breeding for axolotls has exploded over the recent years is good, since it not only discourages catching them in the wild, even if most of the time unsuccessfully, and lets us more easily study them. By the way, On the note of axolotls regeneration, I just want to note something you might be interested in. They can regenerate arms, their tail, their gills, their heart, their spinal cord, and some parts of their brain. What if the whole head is severed? Can it grow another head, or can the head grow another body? No, neither. They can't do either of those things. Calm down. This is because their brain is responsible for the regeneration along with macrophages. Macrophages are cells specialized for the removal of harmful bacteria and regrowth of damaged tissues. We know they play a huge part in axolotl regeneration because when a specimen was injected with something that got rid of macrophages, regeneration was instead replaced with regular old scar tissue. I say regular old scar tissue because that's what we've got. When we lose a limb, we don't regrow it. The tissue just gets scarred. When it comes to their care, axolotls need a moderate amount of care, mostly due to them being aquatic, so that means you'll have to maintain an aquarium. Since I have little to no experience with aquarium setups, a lot of my information on axolotl care I'm getting from the YouTube person Go Herping. He has several videos about his experiences with the animal, making the enclosure, feeding the axolotl, all that jazz. Feel free to check out his content about his axolotl. A lot of good information in those videos that I'm not going to be able to cover here. There's a lot to get into, so let's start with the outside of the enclosure. Axolotls should be kept in, at minimum, a 20-gallon aquarium, and it's important that it's a water-safe aquarium. Enclosures that aren't built for water can sometimes leak all the water out, which would be very dire for an axolotl since they're primarily aquatic. Speaking of aquatic, water filters is something you definitely need to keep in mind. Personally, I don't know a single thing about water filters, so I'd recommend individual research on that one, but water filters are needed. Anything with really good filtration and low flow is suitable. Sponge filters help maintain that effect. However, from what I've heard, one of the best filtration systems you can use would be the AquaClear fish tank filter. The filter isn't reported to be super great with bigger enclosures, but anything from 20 to 40 gallons it does great with. Generally, the water conditions they thrive in are pretty similar to that of freshwater fish. Tank cycling is a must for them, and pH levels of around 6.5 or 8. A general temperature of 60 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit is optimal. If it's difficult to maintain that temperature, try using a fan to blow down onto the water lightly through a screen lid to make evaporation cool the tank. Water changes should be as often as once a week or every other week since they poop often. If you choose to cohab axolotls, I'd recommend a bigger enclosure, which, yes, cohabitation is kind of okay for this species. By the way, cohabitation is when multiple animals are housed together. So there's that. The maximum axolotls I think you could house in one aquarium is most definitely 2. Only 2. No, never cohabitate axolotls less than 6 inches or ones of different sizes, since they're known to cannibalize each other. Cohabbing them with fish is also not a good idea, since the fish will either nibble on the axolotl's gills or the axolotl will eat them. In terms of substrate, you really don't need one. They don't particularly benefit from them, especially not gravel, so that's kind of optional. The only real benefit is it can make the enclosure look a little bit better, sometimes, but in the long term, it'll just make the cleaning infinitely harder. If you want to go through the effort of a substrate, however, aquarium sand works fine. The granules are small enough to pass through an axolotl system if ingested. As stated earlier, never put them on gravel. The rocks in gravel are large enough to cause impaction if ingested. Speaking of ingestion, feeding them a diet consisting of mostly earthworms is optimal. Snails, fish, or even fish fuel axolotl food could work additionally. It's recommended to add aquatic plants, even if they're fake, since axolotls need a hide of some sort. A plastic hide of some kind could also get the job done. Axolotls prefer low light, so keep lighting to a minimum. It's important to note that albino axolotls specifically have very sensitive eyes due to a lack of pigment in them, so keep that in mind when thinking about lighting for them at all. Breeding for the axolotl is interesting compared to the other breeding processes we've discussed, mostly because of how important climate is in the enclosure. Axolotls are most likely to breed in late winter or early spring. To make the axolotl get ready to breed, you'll need to create the illusion of cold weather. If the water isn't already cold, you can fill it with slightly colder water or drop a couple of ice cubes into the enclosure. Once the male and female are ready to breed, the process goes as follows. Step 1, the male tells the female he wants to breed by nudging her. Step 2, if the female is interested, she will proceed to follow the male around the enclosure. Step 3, the male pushes spermatophores out of his cloaca and onto the ground. Spermatophores are capsules of sperm for mating. Step 4, the female walks up to it and sucks the spermatophore inwards with her cloaca. Then step 5, this process is repeated multiple times with many different spermatophores. After 1 to 3 days, the female axolotl will lay anywhere from 100 to 1,000 eggs. Since eggs are almost always laid on plants, transfer the plants to a separate container right after the mother finishes. If they're along the enclosure floor, then suck them up with a turkey baster. After 2 to 4 weeks, the eggs will hatch. Transfer the hatched babies to a separate tank, also with a turkey baster. They can be fed brine shrimp, sea monkeys. Once the babies are much bigger, it's important to separate them from each other so they don't cannibalize one another. 3 weeks in, they'll start growing limbs. At around 3 months of age, they'll be ready to eat bigger foods and have full sets of arms and legs. They're able to be sold at that age. Actually getting your hands on an axolotl is pretty easy if you live anywhere in America except where I am, which is California, or Maine, New Jersey, or Virginia. They, amongst a lot of salamanders, are illegal in those states. If you're not in any of those states, they're about as commonly sold as leopard geckos, maybe a little bit less. Any exotic pet store near you will probably sell them, and there are many booths at reptile expos that'll sell them. If you're looking for one with the typical olive wild-type coloration, you can probably get one for around $20. If you want one with morphs on the fancier side, that's going to cost a lot more. A morph is a variation of an animal, mostly in coloration. Some axolotl morphs can cost anywhere from $45 to $105. That's all for this installment of Herp Corner. As always, sources will be in the description. If you're interested in the topic, I'd recommend looking further into their husbandry or history. If you learned something new with this one, feel free to subscribe. I do these every other week. Have a good evening, morning, or afternoon. Thank you for listening, watching, whatever, and I'll see you next time.